Hi, I'm Ken Sterling, and this is Sports Media 101. Every week we get together and we chop it up about sports media. We talk about the good, the bad, the mediocre, how to take bad and make it good, how to take mediocre, make it great, how to take good and make it great. This is about you doing your job at a higher level so that sports media in general is elevated. That's the point of this. It's why I do it every week, because there's not enough management kind of to go around. Management has been cut just like talent has been cut in this time of trimming budget to maximize profits. You know what? We're not managed at the level we need to be, and there are some base principles for guests and interviewing that need to be respected if you're going to do a great show. So let's talk first about the procurement and booking of guests. There are two kinds of guests that you should want to book. Actually, three. Just thought of a third. Number one, you want a guest who has a unique perspective and a unique ability to convey the essence of that perspective. That's key. That's why we talk to players. That's why we talk to coaches. That's why we talk to former coaches and former players. And a lot of times the former guys are a whole lot better at it than the current guys, because the current guys don't want to offend their employers, namely the teams for whom they work. Former guys, they got nothing to lose. So that's why they're on ESPN, right? And they're talking about how to do that job at a high level and how to watch football in a more intelligent way, or baseball, basketball, hockey, soccer, whatever. Unique perspective is important. If you already have the perspective, don't invite the guest on the show. That makes sense, right? If you already have a unique perspective about a topic, you don't need to have somebody else come on and have that same perspective. That's not interesting. That's echo chamber radio or podcasting. And who wants to listen to that? The answer, that's a hypothetical question. There is no answer to that. Nobody wants to listen to that. A unique ability to entertain, that's number two. If they can be entertaining, a guest, bam, put them on. If they make people laugh, put them on. If they make people think, put them on. If they're engaging, make you engaged as an interviewer. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Because being engaged as an interviewer, what does that make you believe? It makes you believe that the listeners are engaged, right? If you're a good listener for a guest, your listeners are going to be good listeners for a guest. It only stands to reason. The third is that guest makes you sound really good. That, until you're a talent, no manager will ever tell you that unless he or she has hosted a show on their own. If you get a guest who makes you sound really, really smart, book that guest. I had lunch with a former coach, currently a former coach, might become a coach again. And had lunch, and he said, what kind of guests, if I'm a host, what kind of guests do I want to book? Because he was trying out, kind of auditioning for a job at a company in the Midwest. And like, who should I book? I said, book a guest that makes you sound like the smartest man on the face of the earth. Because that's what your audition needs to communicate to the management, that you're really, really smart. So if you got a friend in coaching, in the sport in which you coach, whatever it was or is, you need to get somebody who's going to make you sound awesome. You know what? That might be the best advice I ever gave anybody. What you don't want is a guest, a name, a promotable name. You don't want that. Managers love names, because here's the thing. Managers, at the end of virtually every week, they got to put an email out to their manager. Not the GM, but like the group manager. All right, so the national manager. And if you can say, hey, great booking this week. We had Troy Aikman on our afternoon show, and he was phenomenal. So I'll make this specific to a guy, and I love Eddie White. Eddie White, terrific radio host, works for the Indiana Pacers. Pacers Sports and Entertainment, works his ass off. Worked for me as a talk host for about 2 years, a little over 2 years. And I love Eddie. Eddie always credentialed his show by the name value of the guests that he put on. Always. If we had Troy Aikman on, that made him feel great. Now, Troy Aikman's a pretty good guest, but getting somebody on just because they have a good name, that's not a thing. I've heard loads of good names author turds of segments that you couldn't wait to end. You don't want that. You want listeners to be engaged, and you want them to listen to the entire damn segment. Can you get there with a named guest that you, and Eddie had a relationship with Troy Aikman. He knows Troy Aikman. So those guys could have a pretty good conversation. That might have been not the best example, but he also had people on who weren't very interesting, but they were great names, and it made Eddie feel better to have big name guys and women on that Kravitz and Eddie show. It's meaningless. People want to listen to quality. They don't need, 5-star names. They need 5-star segments. And so you've got to bring that. It's not the who, it's the what and the how of the who. That is how you need to book guests. Another thing that you've got to do when we get into the interview, all right, you need to prepare to interview somebody. And that doesn't mean writing down all of your questions. That's not what it means. And I've managed shows and stations where that was routine, where every question was scripted. No, it never goes anywhere. What you've got to do, like prepare, write down questions, that's fine. But then pick your first one. What's the first question? Here's my first question. Take the rest of the list, wad it up in the can. Ask your first question. And if the guest is worth a damn, the guest will provide you in his answer the second question. Just like in a conversation, and that's what these are. These are conversations. Interviews are conversations. And it's fun to listen to a conversation. Some people say the best radio is overheard. That's a conversation. You go to a bar. You hear two guys at the bar have a great conversation. All of a sudden you start listening to that. You stop paying attention to your smartphone. Stop paying attention to the TV. You're listening to that conversation. That's the job in sports media, is to bring people that level of conversation. And you cannot have that level of conversation if you're not listening to what the other person's talking about. If you're formulating in your head what you're going to say next as your guest is talking, your interview isn't going to make any sense. It's not going to go anywhere, and it needs to go someplace. There needs to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. An exposition, hopefully a conflict of some kind, and then a resolution. That's how these work. And when they do that, it's great. When it's nothing but a recitation of questions, here's a question. All right, why'd you win on Sunday? And then you sit back and you say, okay, your next question is, hey, Matt Ryan didn't play so great, but your defense overcame it. Okay. And you just wait until the guest finishes that answer, and then you ask the follow-up question that you've already got, like pre-scripted. That's going to sound silly, and it's not going to be listenable, and it's bad. It's just bad radio. It's bad podcasting. Trust yourself to listen and hear what should be the next question based upon the answer of the guest. That's not, conceptually, that's not difficult, right? Here's another thing, and this is violated a lot, and it's violated here in Indianapolis quite a bit in sports media. Ask a short question. Shorten your question. Don't explain your question. Don't justify your question. Ask your question. Here's a great question, and this is in Larry King's book. All right, Larry King wrote a book, and he talks about the art of interviewing within the book. And Larry King, I always found kind of obnoxious and silly as a host on CNN, but by God, the guy made a good point about questions. One of the best he ever asked, according to him, and I would agree with him, he's interviewing Joe Montana. And he said, why football? Number one, Joe Montana had probably never been asked that question before. He gave a great answer, and that question was exactly 2 words. It wasn't, why football? And I asked, because As a kid, you must have been a good enough athlete to compete at a variety of sports and would have probably been good at almost anything. And you've got a son who blah, 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 blah. Don't justify the question. Just ask it. It doesn't matter why you're asking. The why you're asking should be implicit and learned from the response of the guest. You don't need to justify the question. Shorten the damn question. The interview isn't about you. It's about your guest and making your guest interesting. And if you can't listen to your guest, then he or she is not interesting enough to continue to talk to. If you're bored in the interview, what do you think the listeners are? What do you think the viewers are? You think they're having a good time? You think it's party time, that they're looking at their radio in their cars like, wow, you know what? That's really tedious. No, that's not what happens. They just punch out. If you bore them, they're going to punch out. And the greatest way to figure out whether they're bored is in whether you're bored. So if you're bored with a guest, they're going to be bored with a guest, and you got to move the hell on. Do not have guests because they eat time. Well, I booked him in a 12-minute segment, or I booked him in a 25-minute segment. So I had to keep him for the 12 minutes or the 25 minutes or whatever. No, no, and no. You don't. If you don't pivot from a bad guest, what are you doing? And look, there are easy bookings and there are difficult bookings. Easy bookings are the guys who are always available. And you think, well, he'll say yes, he'll come on, and that'll be a segment of the show that I won't have to worry about. He's kind of long-winded, so that's good. I don't have to ask too many questions. Wow, are you barking up way the wrong tree? That is just absolutely wrong-headed, and it's actually disrespectful to your audience. You have got to do better work than that. Putting somebody on the air where you know the answer to the question that you are going to ask. All right? And this is true for a lot of, and I could pigeonhole this with specifics, but I won't. There are people who are paid to be guests. You know, paid by their teams. It is really unusual to get a high quality response from somebody whose meal ticket is punched by the team that you are asking them about. It is really, the ask is too much with that kind of guest. You cannot ask that guest to be honest with you about the performance of that team, right? You can't, because they're being paid by the team. And do you think that your listeners don't already know that? So what are you doing? You're just putting people on the air to eat time. And shame on you for doing it. Because what you're doing is eroding the value of the medium you communicate in. Shorten your questions and only ask questions of people who are going to give you a real response. Don't book guests because it's easy. Book guests because they will be interesting. And never book a guest just because he's a great name. Doesn't mean you can't book a guest with a great name. Some of them are really interesting. Great guest, Johnny Bench. Best guest I ever had on. Johnny Bench I had on for 40 minutes without a break because I couldn't stop asking questions of this guy. That was fun. That was fun not just for me, it was fun for listeners. And that's what you're in business for. Next week, we're going to talk about the art of managing managers. Look, you got a bad manager, you're not being managed correctly, a lot of that responsibility falls on you.